November 19, 1944. Gebling, France. A Sherman tank sits frozen on a frozen road, and then a German anti-tank round punches through its hull at 3,000 feet per second. Fire. Steel screaming. Metal folding like paper. Inside that tank, a wounded staff sergeant who had already refused morphine, refused evacuation, refused for 12 straight days, to leave the men he commanded, is killed in a single instant. His name was Reuben Rivers. He should have been lying in a hospital bed 100 miles away. He chose to burn in a Sherman instead because he believed his men needed him more than his leg needed saving. And here is the part that will make your blood run cold. The country he died for would take 53 years to admit he deserved its highest honor. But Rivers is not the man this story is about. This story is about a quiet tank crewman with a pencil, a small notebook, and 11 names written inside it. A man nobody in the United States Army was supposed to notice. A man who on one freezing night in the rain wrote a single sheet of paper that forced a 3-star general to climb into a jeep at 10:30 at night and drive 100 miles through the dark to change the way an entire army behaved. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, do this for me. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more untold moments, forgotten heroes, and the events history tried to bury. There is so much more ahead, and you are not going to want to miss a single second of it. His name was Calvin Reeves. He was 31 years old. Before the war, he had worked with his hands a mechanic who could take an engine apart in the dark and put it back together by feel. He was not a general. He was not a politician. He was a sergeant in the 761st Tank Battalion, the first all-black armored unit ever to see combat for the United States. And what he did with one sheet of paper and one stub of pencil is something the official record almost lost forever. By the end of this story, you will understand how 11 names, 100 miles, 1 hour in the rain, and exactly 7 words ended a practice that had been humiliating American soldiers for years. But first, you have to understand the war these men were dropped into and the enemy that was not always in front of them. Sometimes it was standing behind the serving counter of their own mess hall. October 10, 1944. Omaha Beach. By the time the 761st Tank Battalion came ashore, the worst of D-Day was 4 months in the past. The bodies were buried, the wreckage was cleared. What remained was gray sand, the smell of metal in the water, and an Atlantic light that made everything look older than it was. Calvin Reeves stepped off the landing craft in the mid-morning cold. He had been a soldier for 2 years and 7 months. He had trained in Louisiana. He had trained in Texas. He had trained in places that asked him to sit at the back of the bus just to reach the base where he would learn to command a Sherman tank. He looked at the beach, he looked at the cliffs, and he thought one thing: this is what we crossed an ocean for. Understand what that ocean cost. The 761st was the first all-black armored unit to fight for America, and that single sentence is easy to write but almost impossible to carry, because it does not contain the 2 years they spent training while white units shipped out ahead of them. It does not contain the bases they were forbidden to leave. It does not contain the diners near those bases where their uniforms meant nothing. It does not contain the day in the summer of 1944 at Camp Hood, Texas, when a young lieutenant assigned to this very battalion refused to move to the back of a military bus and was court-martialed for it. His name was Jackie Robinson. Yes, that Jackie Robinson. He never deployed with them. The court-martial and an old ankle injury kept him stateside while the battalion shipped out without him. These men had spent years being told in 1,000 small and quiet ways that the Army did not really believe they were soldiers. And now they were being asked to prove they were in the coldest, deadliest corner of the European war. The problem was enormous. The United States Army needed tanks and tank crews desperately in the autumn of 1944, but the same Army had spent decades refusing to let black men fight in armor at all. The result was a battalion of superbly trained soldiers who had been kept on the shelf while the war burned through everyone else. Failed policy, wasted men, lives lost on the line because the reinforcements were sitting in Texas ready, willing, and unwelcome. But everything was about to change because of 2 men almost nobody expected to care. The first was their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates. He was white, he was 36, and he had taken command of the 761st at a time when the Army assumed any white officer assigned to a black unit was either being punished or had no career left worth saving. Bates had a career. He was offered transfers. He was offered promotions. The message was always the same. No man could rise in this army with this assignment on his record. He said no, every time. He stayed in his own plain words because he had trained these men, he knew their names, and he believed that if he left, no one else would ever let them fight. The second man was far more famous and far more complicated. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, 59 years old, 2 ivory-handled revolvers, a temper famous on 3 continents. And here is the thing history has to hold honestly because it is uncomfortable. In his private diary in his own handwriting, Patton had written that he did not believe black soldiers were capable of the kind of combat this war was about to demand. And then he requested the 761st anyway, not because he was forced to. Other generals had refused units exactly like this, and the Army absorbed their refusal without a word. Patton said, "Send them." He said it because he had read their training reports. He had seen their gunnery scores, and his army needed tanks that could shoot, and here were men who could shoot better than most. So they came. And here is where his story turns on one specific day. November 2nd, 1944, in the town of Saint-Nicolas-de-Port, in the Lorraine region of eastern France. Patton climbed onto the hood of a half-track wearing the helmet with the 3 stars. The men of the 761st stood in formation in front of him. He waited until the silence was the silence he wanted. Then he spoke words that have been written down, repeated, and confirmed by the men who heard them. He told them they were the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army. He told them he would never have asked for them if they were not good. He told them he had nothing but the best in his army, and that he did not care what color they were, as long as they went up there and killed the enemy. For men who had spent 2 years being treated as an administrative inconvenience, those words landed like a thunderclap. A man with 3 stars had asked for them. It mattered. It mattered the way being seen by an institution that has refused to see you always matters. And that is the tension you must carry through this entire story, because the same week Patton stood on that half-track, he wrote uglier things in his private diary. The speech was real. The diary was real. The man was both. And on a freezing night not long after, that same contradiction was going to arrive at midnight in the rain and do something nobody expected. The 761st carried that speech into their first major fight 6 days later, and then into Vic-sur-Seine, into Moncourt, past the wreckage of tanks whose crews had not been lucky, and into the wreckage of tanks whose crews were themselves. And on one freezing day in the middle of November, after a week of non-stop combat, they were pulled back 100 miles behind the front for 48 hours of what the Army called rest. It was raining when they arrived. Understand this rain. It was not a summer storm. It was the rain of Lorraine in late autumn, steady and methodical, falling in temperatures that hovered 3 degrees above freezing. The kind of rain that soaks through a wool uniform in 20 minutes and stays there until fire dries it out. The rest area had been a barracks complex before the war, low gray buildings around a central yard. The 761st had been on the road since dawn. They had lost men. They had buried men. Calvin Reeves kept a small notebook in his breast pocket with the names of the dead, no dates, no causes, just the names, because the names were what the Army's paperwork was likeliest to lose. He had 11 names in that book by the middle of November. He had room for many more. They lined up at the mess hall at 4 in the afternoon. Ahead of them were white soldiers from a quartermaster company, older men, most in their 30s. Men whose war was lived behind desks and inside trucks. They took their trays. They took their seats inside where it was warm and dry. The 761st waited. And then the mess officer, a captain who had never been in combat, stepped out from behind the serving counter. He held up a hand. He cleared his throat like a man who had rehearsed this. And he said, "I am going to have to ask you men to wait." He said it without anger. He said it without cruelty. He said it in the voice of a man who believed he was simply enforcing a rule. He explained that the facility was built for a single dining population. He explained that the regulation permitted separation, and then he said the sentence that put American soldiers in the rain. "There is room outside under the overhang. You can take your trays out there." Then he walked back behind his counter as if nothing at all had happened. There was no overhang. There had been one once. All that remained were rusted iron brackets sticking out of a wall, the wood long since rotted or stolen for firewood. What remained was the wall, the ground, and the rain. So the men of the 761st sat down on the wet ground with their trays, the exact same food the white soldiers were eating on the exact same metal trays, and they ate it as it went cold in the rain. They did not speak much. They ate the way men eat when they have learned that complaint changes nothing. Reeves sat with his back against the wall, his tray in his lap, watching the rain hit his food, thinking about 11 names, thinking about 3 of those men who had died in a single instant, doing exactly what this army had asked of them. He did not finish his meal. Watching all of this through a fogged window from inside the warm mess hall was a man with a notebook of his own. Tresvant Anderson, 38 years old, a black war correspondent for the Pittsburgh Courier, the largest black newspaper in the country. He had crossed the Atlantic with these men so that what they did would be witnessed by someone who could not be made to look away. He had stood 10 feet from that captain. He had heard every word. And now he opened his notebook and wrote down the time, the date, the location, the captain's rank, the temperature, and the rain. He filed a dispatch about it that very evening. The Army censors killed it. It never ran. He kept the carbon copy, and that copy would not be read by the public for decades long after every man it could have helped in 1944 was already gone. But Anderson was not the only one writing that night. Back in the barracks, Calvin Reeves peeled off his soaked jacket and hung it from the rail at the foot of his bunk. He took off his boots. He sat for a long time looking at the floor. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out a single sheet of paper and a pencil. He sharpened that pencil with a small knife he had carried since basic training. He set the paper on the lid of his footlocker, and he began to write. It was not a complaint. It was not an angry letter. It was a report formatted exactly the way the United States Army formatted reports in 1944. A heading, a date, a cold, precise list of facts, names, ranks, times, the location, the regulation cited, the conditions described, the men listed. He wrote it without a single word of emotion because he knew that the smallest trace of anger would give the reader an excuse to dismiss the whole thing. It took him 2 hours. He read it through twice. Then he went to sleep with his back to the wall the way he had slept since basic training, not knowing that this one sheet of paper was about to travel farther than he ever imagined. He submitted it at 7 the next morning to the battalion's executive officer, a major who had served with him since Texas. The major looked at the report. He looked at Reeves. And he said, "Calvin, you understand where this goes?" Reeves said he understood. Both men knew the truth. A report from a black sergeant about racial discrimination in the Army of 1944 had a completely predictable ending. It would be received. It would be acknowledged. It would be filed. And it would be forgotten. The regulation was the regulation. But the major took it anyway because he had served with Reeves long enough to know the man never filed paperwork without reason. He carried it up to brigade that afternoon. The brigade adjutant filed it in a wooden in-tray on a wooden desk. And then by a chain of events, the historical record cannot fully reconstruct that piece of paper, did something reports like it were never supposed to do. It moved. A captain on the brigade staff knew an officer on the 3rd Army staff. That 3rd Army officer knew one of Patton's own aides. And the report began to travel up a hidden network of acquaintances and favors, higher and higher, until 2 days after a soaked and freezing sergeant wrote it in pencil. On the lid of a footlocker, it landed on the desk of the most famous general in the United States Army. It arrived in the evening. Patton's aide brought it in with the rest of that night's correspondence. And the aide who described this moment, decades later to a researcher, said, "Patton read the report once. Then he read it again. Then he set it down and went very quiet, the kind of quiet the aide had learned to recognize. Not anger. Not yet. Something slower. The look of a man who has just received information that slipped past every filter he normally used to hold the world at a distance and landed somewhere the filter could not touch. Patton asked exactly one question. He asked whether this facility was inside his operational area. The aide checked. He confirmed that it was, and Patton said 4 words that were about to launch one of the strangest journeys of his entire command. "Have my vehicle ready." The aide asked if he meant in the morning. Patton said, "I mean now." It was 10:30 at night. The rain was still falling. Somewhere 100 miles away, Calvin Reeves was already asleep, with his back against the wall, with no idea that the report he had written to keep a record nobody would read had reached the one man in France with the authority and the temper to do something about it. He did not know that a jeep was being fueled in the dark. He did not know that 3 stars were about to drive 100 miles through the freezing Lorraine night, straight toward the mess hall that had put his men in the rain. So the question that hangs over everything that comes next is simple, and it is enormous. What does a 3-star general actually do when he arrives unannounced at 15 minutes past midnight at a facility whose commander is fast asleep and has no idea he is coming? Does he write a memo? Does he file a complaint of his own and let the machinery grind it into dust like every report before it? Or does he do something that no regulation on earth could have predicted? Something that ended a humiliation in a single night, but left a far larger question burning behind it. And the answer tells you everything about the difference between changing one night and changing an entire army. In part 2, we walk into the rain beside him. We stand in that yard at midnight, and we hear the 7 words that changed everything, and the one thing they could not change at all. When we left off, a soaked and freezing tank sergeant named Calvin Reeves had done something the United States Army of 1944 believed was pointless. He had written a single report in pencil on the lid of a footlocker about black soldiers being forced to eat in the rain while white soldiers ate in the warm. And against every rule of how the army was supposed to work, that report had climbed a hidden ladder of favors and acquaintances all the way to the desk of the most feared general in Europe. Now George S. Patton was in a jeep in the dark driving 100 miles through the freezing Lorraine night toward the mess hall that had done it. But changing one mess hall was the easy part, because the thing Patton was about to run into was not a man. It was an institution, a written regulation backed by decades of policy, defended by officers who believed they were doing nothing wrong at all. And here is the number that should stop you cold. The United States Army would remain officially segregated for 4 more years after this night. 4 years. Which means that whatever Patton did in that yard, he was one man standing against a machine far larger than himself. And this is exactly where everything gets worse. The drive took the better part of 2 hours. The roads were wet. Visibility was almost nothing. The corporal at the wheel had been with Patton for 14 months, and he had learned one rule above all others. You did not ask questions about a destination decided after 10 at night. Patton sat in the passenger seat and said nothing. The aide sat in the back and said nothing. The only sounds were the engine, the rain drumming on the canvas, and the occasional creak of leather as the general shifted his weight. He had not slept. He had not eaten since the previous afternoon. In the pocket of his coat was a report written by a sergeant whose name he had read so many times he could not stop reading it. They arrived at 15 minutes past midnight. The facility's duty officer was a second lieutenant, 25 years old, reading a cheap paperback novel in the small office by the main gate. He heard an engine at an hour when no engine was expected. He stood. He put on his cap. He walked out into the rain. And then he saw 3 stars, catching what little light there was on the helmet of a man in the passenger seat of a jeep. Years later, he described that moment in a letter to his wife. He wrote that in 3 years of service, he had never felt anything quite like it. It was, he said, the attention of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is now simply doing it. Think about what that lieutenant was feeling in that instant. He was 25 years old. He commanded nothing and no one of consequence. He had opened a paperback to pass a wet, boring midnight shift, And now the single most famous soldier in the American Army was climbing out of a jeep in front of him in the rain with murder in his posture and no announcement, no staff column, no warning of any kind. His hands were shaking. He said so in the letter. He saluted, and he held the salute a beat too long because he did not know what else a man was supposed to do. The lieutenant offered to wake the commanding officer. Patton said one word, "Yes." The lieutenant colonel who ran the facility was asleep fully clothed, the way field officers sometimes are. He pulled on his coat. He pulled on his boots. He came out into the yard with his collar fastened wrong, the collar of a man who had dressed in bad light and worse fear. Patton did not mention the collar. He did not raise his voice. He said quietly that he wanted to walk through the facility. And so they walked. Through the mess hall, through the kitchen, through the sleeping quarters, through the supply room, and finally out along the eastern wall to the strip of open ground where just hours earlier the men of the 761st had sat on the wet earth with their trays. Understand who this colonel was because he was not a monster. That is the uncomfortable truth. He was a career administrator. He believed in the chain of command. He believed that a regulation existed to be enforced and that a good officer enforced it whether he liked it or not. In his mind, he had made no decision at all. He had simply applied a rule. And that is the most dangerous enemy in this entire story. Not a man who hates. A man who follows. A man who can watch soldiers sit in freezing rain and feel nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a job done by the book. The ground was still wet. Patton stopped. He looked at the ground. Then he looked at the door of the mess hall 10 feet away, where warm light still leaked through the fogged glass. He looked at the distance between that door and the place where men had been ordered to eat. He looked at it for a long time in the rain in the dark, the 3 stars on his helmet catching the light from the building behind him. Then he turned to the lieutenant colonel and said 3 words. "Explain it to me." The colonel explained. He cited the regulation by number. He cited the dining capacity of the facility. He cited the practical realities of managing a rear area post with mixed populations. "Sir," he said, "the facility was built for a single dining population. The regulation permits separation. I made the arrangement the rules allowed." He described a chain of policy that in his telling had never been a choice at all, only the correct application of the rules the Army required him to follow. He spoke the way men speak when they believe the rule book will protect them. And you will notice what was missing from every single word of it. There was no mention of the men, no mention of the rain, no mention of the 11 names in a sergeant's notebook, or the fact that 3 of them had died the week before doing exactly what this army had asked. To the colonel, this was a logistics problem. To Patton, it had just become something else entirely. He listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He let the man finish completely. And when the colonel had nothing left to say, there was a silence in that yard, broken only by the rain. Then Patton spoke. The duty officer wrote his words down in the letter to his wife. The aide confirmed them decades later to a researcher, and the historical record has carried them forward as the center of the night. Patton said in the same quiet voice that in his operational area, wrong regulations did not keep operating simply because they were regulations. They stopped. He said the moment he said they stopped, and then he turned to the mess arrangements and to the officers standing frozen around him, and he gave the order that ended it. 7 words. Feed them inside, all of them. Tonight. The colonel did not answer. There was nothing to answer. The rulebook he had hidden behind had just been overruled by a man with the authority to overrule it, and both of them knew that no regulation on earth outranks a 3-star general standing in your yard at midnight. Patton did not shout. He did not threaten a court-martial. He did not need to. He had come 100 miles in the freezing dark for the single purpose of standing on that spot and saying those words with his own mouth so that no one could later pretend the order had come from somewhere else. It had come from him, in person, and that was the entire point. Now here is the thing the movies would leave out, and the thing that makes this story true instead of comfortable. The men of the 761st were asleep while this happened. Calvin Reeves was in his bunk back against the wall, the way he had slept since basic training, with no idea that the report he had written to keep a record no one would read had just pulled a general out of his headquarters in the middle of the night. He did not hear the Jeep. He did not hear the 7 words. The most important moment of his war happened 100 feet away from him while he slept, and he would not learn of it for hours. The change happened in the dark, quietly, the way real change usually does. At 2 in the morning, a work detail was pulled from sleep and told the dining hall would be reconfigured before sunrise. They dragged 6 tables out of the supply room tables that had been stacked and forgotten since some earlier occupant left them behind. They set them up in the warm, and at 6 in the morning, breakfast was served. The same kitchen staff, the same metal trays, the same food that had gone cold in the rain the day before. But now, there were tables, and there was a roof, and the door stayed open to everyone. The men of the 761st walked in through the front door. They took their trays, they sat at the new tables, and they ate inside in the dry for the first time at that facility. It was not a perfect scene. Several of them described it decades later with painful honesty. The white quartermaster soldiers ate at their tables. The black tank crewmen ate at theirs. The 2 groups did not speak. There was a stiffness in the room, the specific discomfort of people who have been forced apart for so long that being in the same room feels strange. But they were inside, together, in the warm. And that was new. And there was one man who understood exactly what he was watching. Tres Vant Anderson, the black war correspondent who had crossed the ocean with these men, was there for breakfast, and he saw the tables. He saw the men of the 761st walk through the front door, and he understood better than anyone in that room how rare and how fragile this moment was. He had filed a dispatch about the rain the night before, and the Army censors had killed it. Now he watched the humiliation reversed overnight by a general most of the country worshipped, and he knew that this reversal would probably be censored too, or buried, or lost. So he wrote it down anyway, because that was the whole job. Keep the record even when no one will let you publish it, and trust that a future you will never see might one day read it. Calvin Reeves ate his breakfast that morning without knowing why the tables were there. He learned the truth at 9 o'clock, when the battalion was already preparing to move back toward the front. The story came to him the way stories move through an army, from the duty officer to the executive officer to the major, and finally to Reeves himself. The major did not dress it up. He stated it plainly. The general came. The general walked the facility. The general said what he said. The arrangements were changed. Reeves listened. He did not say much. He nodded once, and he went to find his tank. He did not celebrate. He did not brag to the other crews. In the years after the war, when he told this story to his students, he barely mentioned the general. To Reeves, the hero of the night was never the man with 3 stars. It was the sheet of paper. But before you celebrate too hard, you need to hear what happened to the man who started it all, because this is where the story stops being a fairy tale. The lieutenant colonel who put those soldiers in the rain was not relieved of command. This is documented. His command continued. There is no entry in his service record showing any disciplinary action at all. The captain who gave the actual order at the serving counter was never investigated. The Army made no formal finding. The Army launched no inquiry. Patton did not pursue it. He had changed one facility on one night by the raw force of the 3 stars on his helmet, and then he got back in his Jeep and drove away. And this is the second brutal truth this story has to hold. The midnight visit was not justice, it was authority. Patton arrived, Patton spoke, Patton left. The institution that had permitted the humiliation was not reformed. The regulation that had been cited was never rewritten. The men who gave the order kept their commissions, kept their assignments, and went right on serving in an army whose written rules still permitted the exact thing Patton had just overruled. Change one mess hall, and you have changed one mess hall. You have not changed the machine that built it. So the only thing standing between the next group of black soldiers and the next decision to put them in the rain was a terrifying set of maybes. Maybe someone else would write a report. Maybe that report would find a hidden network to carry it upward. Maybe it would reach another officer with stars and a temper who would decide to drive through the night. That was not a system. That was luck. And luck does not scale to an army of millions. 2 days later, the change was recorded in the facility's daily administrative report. The officer who filed it did not mention Patton. He did not mention the midnight jeep. He did not mention the rain, or the 7 words, or the tables dragged out at 2 in the morning. He wrote a single flat administrative line stating that dining arrangements had been modified to accommodate all personnel without separation. That was the entire record. A moral reckoning that had pulled a general 100 miles through the dark was reduced in the file to one cold bureaucratic sentence that almost no one would ever read. Because rear area administrative records from 1944 are not the documents that make it into the famous histories. They sit in boxes. They get cataloged eventually. They get found by researchers looking for something else entirely. And Calvin Reeves went back to war. That is the part the story cannot let you forget. He did not get a medal for the report. He did not get a mention in a dispatch. He got a tank and a road and the front. The 761st climbed back into their Shermans the very next day and drove straight back toward the fighting, back toward the mud and the anti-tank guns and the names that Reeves would keep adding to the notebook in his breast pocket. 11 names by mid-November. There would be more. There were always more. Because while one general had won one argument in 1 yard, the war itself was getting worse. The 761st was about to fight through the rest of November through Vic-sur-Seille and Morville, and the frozen ridges of Lorraine, and then straight into the single most desperate battle of the entire Western War. Their casualties were not light. They would fight for 183 consecutive days, longer than almost any American armored unit in the theater. And every one of those days would ask them to prove all over again what the Army still refused to write down in its rulebook. And there was one more thing waiting in the dark. One debt the Army had not yet paid and would try very hard to never pay at all. Because on November 7th near Vic-sur-Seille, a tank commander in the 761st named Reuben Rivers had already been badly wounded in the leg by mine fragments. He had refused morphine. He had refused evacuation. He had stayed in his tank and kept fighting, and he would keep fighting for 12 more days on a wound the medics said should have taken him off the field on the first hour of the first day. His commanding officer would recommend him for the Medal of Honor. And then the paperwork would vanish into the same silence that had almost swallowed Calvin Reeves's report. So here is where part 2 leaves you. A sergeant with a pencil forced a general to drive through the night. A general with 3 stars overruled a regulation with 7 words. And a mess hall that had put men in the rain now let them eat in the warm. From ridicule to reckoning in a single freezing night. It should feel like a victory. But the machine was still standing. The regulation was still written. The colonel still had his command. And the war still had its worst months waiting. In part 3, the story stops being about one mess hall and becomes about something far larger and far darker. Because as the 761st drove deeper into the fighting, the record of what they did began to disappear. Recommendations lost, dispatches censored, reports that vanished from the files as if they had never existed. Someone somewhere did not want this written down. And the fight that Calvin Reeves started with a single sheet of paper was about to become a fight over memory itself, over who gets remembered, who gets erased, and how long a country can look away from the men who won its war. The real battle was only just beginning. So far, this has been the story of one sheet of paper. A tank sergeant named Calvin Reeves wrote a report about black soldiers forced to eat in freezing rain. That report climbed a hidden ladder all the way to General Patton, who drove 100 miles at midnight and ended the humiliation with 7 words. But a general can win an argument in a yard. He cannot win a war, and the only way the men of the 761st Tank Battalion were ever going to change what the Army believed about them was to do it the hard way in combat against the Germans in the coldest and bloodiest winter of the entire war in the West. And here is the number that frames everything that comes next. Over the months ahead, This single battalion would fight for 183 consecutive days without meaningful relief longer than almost any American armored unit in Europe. They would break the Siegfried Line. They would fight through the Battle of the Bulge. And by the end, the same enemy that Patton's own diary doubted these men could face would be running from them across 3 countries. This is no longer a story about a mess hall. This is a story about proof written in fire. It began in the mud of Lorraine. On November 7th and 8th, 1944, the 761st went into its first major combat near the villages of Moyenvic and Vic-sur-Seille in eastern France. The Germans holding that sector were veterans. They had dug in. They had anti-tank guns sighted on every road. And they had no idea, and frankly, no interest in the color of the men inside the Shermans grinding toward them. To the German gunners, a Sherman was a Sherman. It burned the same. Which meant, for the very first time, the 761st was measured by the only judge that never lies, the enemy. The judgment came fast, and it came expensive. On that first day, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the white commander who had refused a dozen transfers to stay with these men, was cut down by enemy fire and evacuated. The battalion lost its commander in its opening hours. And still it kept moving. The tankers pushed through Moyenvic, through Vic-sur-Seille, into the teeth of prepared German positions, and they did not break. Within days, the battalion had taken its objectives and killed or driven off the defenders. The German line in that sector bent, and then it gave. But the Germans learned quickly, and they responded the way a professional army responds. In the German command posts of that sector, the reports were the same ones every retreating unit filed. American armor pressing hard, positions overrun, anti-tank screens knocked out faster than they could be rebuilt. The German officers writing those reports did not know they were being beaten by a unit their enemy's own government considered second class. They only knew the tanks kept coming and would not stop. So they did what beaten professionals do. They pulled back to stronger ground. They massed anti-tank guns at the villages of Morville and Gabling. They laid minefields across every approach. And they waited for the American armor to come to them. The 761st came anyway. And it was here in this grinding week of village fighting that the battalion produced the man whose name would haunt the United States Army for the next 50 years. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was a tank commander from Oklahoma. On November 8th, a mine tore his tank and threw a fragment deep into his leg, opening a wound to the bone. The medics wanted him out. He refused. He refused morphine, so his head would stay clear. He refused evacuation, so his crew would not lose their commander. He wrapped the wound and he stayed in the fight day after day on a leg that should have put him in a hospital bed 100 miles behind the line. For nearly 2 weeks he led from the front. Then, on November 19th near Gebling, his tank rolled into the sights of German anti-tank guns. Rivers spotted them. He had a choice: pull back to cover or stay and cover the withdrawal of the tanks behind him. He chose to stay. He opened fire, and a German round found his turret and killed him instantly. His commanding officer would recommend Reuben Rivers for the Medal of Honor. Remember that, because that recommendation was about to vanish, and the disappearance of it is the dark thread that runs through everything still to come. But there was no time to grieve in November of 1944, because far to the north in the frozen forests of Belgium, Adolf Hitler was about to gamble the last strength of the German army on one enormous roll of the dice, and the 761st was about to be thrown directly into its path. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its final great offensive in the West. Roughly 250,000 German troops backed by hundreds of tanks smashed into thin American lines in the Ardennes. This was the Battle of the Bulge, the largest single battle the United States Army fought in the entire war. The German plan was simple and desperate: punch through the weakest point, split the Allied armies, race to the sea. And for the first shocked days it worked. American units were overrun. Thousands were captured. The line buckled and bent backward into a great bulge, the shape that gave the battle its name. Patton's Third Army wheeled north in one of the most famous maneuvers in military history, turning 90 degrees in the dead of winter to counterattack the German flank. and the 761st went with them. From the relative structure of the Lorraine fighting, the battalion was flung into pure chaos snow to the hub's temperatures far below freezing roads, sheeted in ice, German infantry and armor dug into forests they knew far better than the Americans did. Tank engines froze, fingers froze to metal, and the fighting was not the clean armored duels of doctrine. It was close, ugly village by village, tree line by tree line. The strain on the battalion was enormous, and it was not only the enemy. When you push tanks that hard for that long, machines break. Tracks through. Engines seized in the cold. Fuel and ammunition had to be dragged forward over roads that were sometimes under fire and always under snow. Crews went days without real sleep. The men who had trained for 2 years while the country debated whether they were soldiers were now being asked to do the impossible, with equipment that was failing and support that was thin, in the worst winter Western Europe had seen in decades, and the losses kept coming. Tank commanders killed, drivers wounded. The notebook in Calvin Reeves's breast pocket, the one that held the names of the dead, kept filling. And here is the cruelty layered on top of the cold. Even as these men bled to hold the line, the machinery of recognition ground on somewhere else, and it ground against them. The river's recommendation was in the system. It went nowhere. Dispatches from the Black War correspondent traveling with the unit were held delayed or cut by censors. The men could feel it. They were doing everything the Army had asked in the hardest conditions the war could offer, and the record of it was thinning out behind them as if someone did not want it kept. For a soldier freezing in a Belgian forest, that is its own kind of wound. You start to wonder whether any of it will ever be written down at all. There were darker hours too, the ones the official histories rarely dwell on. When a tank brewed up and took its crew with it, someone had to write the report. When the maps were wrong, and an attack went in against a strong point no one had known was there, someone caught the blame, and it was rarely the officers far to the rear who had drawn the arrows. The men at the sharp end absorbed the mistakes of a system that had never fully trusted them, and they absorbed the losses those mistakes caused. In the worst nights of that winter, some of them must have wondered whether the whole thing had been a setup, whether they had been sent to the hardest places precisely because someone upstairs would not mind if the experiment quietly failed. Then morning came, and they climbed back into the tanks anyway. Then came the town that would define them. Tillet. Tillet is a small village in the Belgian Ardennes. In the first days of January 1945, it sat astride ground the Germans meant to hold, and it was defended by tough, experienced German troops with armor and anti-tank guns in support. The 761st was ordered to take it. What followed was not a single clean assault. It was a brutal days-long fight, and it is the sharpest example of what these men could do when everything was against them. Picture it: snow on the ground, gray sky, cold that bites through everything. The Shermans move forward, German guns open up, a tank is hit, it burns. The crews of the others do not stop, they spread out, they push. First attempt the Germans hold. The tankers pull back, regroup, and come again. Second attempt, the Germans hold again. The fighting swings back and forth across frozen fields, as the Germans, who are very good and very determined, refuse to give up the town. The Germans throw everything into holding it. Machine guns rake the open ground. Anti-tank rounds streak between the trees. Mortars walk across the American positions. Every time the 761st pushes into the edge of the village, the defenders drive them back. Men fall in the snow. Tanks smoke and burn on the approaches. And still the next morning, the Shermans line up and go in again. A survivor of that fight later remembered it in the simplest terms. He said they were cold, they were tired, and they had decided they were not going to be the ones who quit. Not there, not after everything. But the 761st does not quit. This is the thing the enemy did not expect. Day after day, the battalion presses the attack. The tanks work with the infantry, blasting strong points, silencing anti-tank positions one at a time. A gun that held up the advance for an hour is spotted, flanked, destroyed. Then the next one. Then the next. German fire slackens. German counterattacks fail. The defenders' elite troops, who had stopped other units cold, begin to break under the relentless pressure. And after days of grinding combat, Tilsit falls. The Germans, who can retreat, retreat. Those who cannot, do not. The cost was real. The 761st left men and tanks in the snow around Tilsit. But so did the enemy in far greater numbers. Across the Ardennes, fighting the battalion tore through German infantry, knocked out armor and anti-tank guns, and helped shatter the southern shoulder of the German offensive. The Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble, collapsed. By late January, the Germans had been driven back to where they started, having spent the last reserve of men and tanks they could not replace. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies had instead destroyed the German army's ability to attack in the West ever again, and the 761st had been in the middle of it, not in the rear, not in a labor role. In the fighting at the front, doing exactly what armor is supposed to do against the best troops Germany had left. The men who 2 years earlier had been told the army did not really believe they were soldiers had just helped stop the largest German offensive of the war in the West. Let that land. The proof was no longer a training score on a range in Texas. The proof was a broken enemy in the snow of Belgium. News of what these tankers were doing began to travel quietly, unevenly, but it traveled. Word moved through Patton's Third Army. Word moved among the units who fought alongside them and saw with their own eyes what the 761st could do. The old assumption, the one baked into policy and into a general's private diary, did not survive contact with the evidence. You cannot watch a battalion break the Bulge and still tell yourself its men cannot fight. After the Bulge, the pace did not slow. It accelerated. In the spring of 1945, the 761st smashed into the Siegfried Line, the belt of concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth, and interlocking guns that Germany had built to make its western border impregnable. Other units had bled against those defenses. The 761st punched through, helping to crack open a section of the line and pour into Germany itself. From there, it became a pursuit. The German army in the West was disintegrating, and the 761st was among the units driving the wreck of it eastward, town after town, river after river, faster than the enemy could reform. The strategic picture had flipped completely. In November, the question had been whether these men could survive their first fight. By spring, the question was how many miles they could advance in a day. Faster, deeper, harder. Over the length of the campaign, the battalion drove across France, Belgium, Germany, and into Austria, capturing dozens of towns and cities, taking thousands of prisoners, and by the battalion's own reckoning, inflicting enormous losses on the enemy across those 6 months of near-continuous combat. They started as the Army's experiment. They finished as one of its hardest-driving armored units. Look at the ledger the campaign left behind: 183 days of near-continuous combat, more than 30 major towns and objectives taken, thousands of German soldiers captured and marched to the rear, enemy tanks, anti-tank guns, artillery pieces, and vehicles destroyed in numbers that ran into the hundreds. And in exchange, the battalion paid with dozens of its own men killed and many more wounded, and with tanks lost in nearly every fight from Lorraine to Austria. Every one of those casualties was a name. Every one of those names had trained for 2 years to be allowed to die for a country that still would not seat him at the front of a bus. That is the arithmetic the 761st carried across a continent, and the effect rippled outward. Units that fought beside them stopped seeing an experiment and started seeing a battalion they wanted on their flank. Commanders who had inherited the old assumptions watched those assumptions die in the field. The men themselves carried a new certainty out of the war, the certainty that comes only from having been tested at the highest level and having passed. You cannot argue a man out of that. He earned it in the snow, and no regulation can take it back. The advance carried them all the way to the Enns River, near Steyr in Austria, in the first days of May, 1945. There, at the far edge of the war, they linked up with soldiers of the Soviet Red Army, pushing in from the east. Two armies that had started thousands of miles apart met in the ruin of Hitler's Reich, and among the Americans standing at that meeting point were the black tankers of the 761st, the men who had been told to eat in the rain. Around the same time, elements of the battalion reached the horror of a Nazi concentration camp in their path and helped open its gates. They had crossed an entire continent, and at the end of it, they were among the men who saw exactly what they had been fighting against. Then the war in Europe ended. The guns went quiet, and the 761st Tank Battalion, 1st All-Black Armored Unit to fight for the United States, could count its record in the coldest possible terms: 183 days in near-constant combat. A commander shot down in the opening hours who came back to lead them. A staff sergeant dead in a turret near Gebling with a Medal of Honor recommendation that no one could find. The Bulge broken. The Siegfried Line cracked. 3 countries crossed. An enemy shattered and running. The proof was total, and it was written in fire and snow and the names in a sergeant's notebook. So the men of the 761st had answered the question the army never dared to ask honestly. They could fight. They had fought as well as anyone. They had bled for a country that still on paper and its own regulations refused to treat them as equals. And that is the terrible hinge this story now turns on. Because winning the war was supposed to settle it. It did not. The record that should have made them legends was already going missing. The Rivers recommendation was already lost. The dispatches were already buried. And the deeper truth was waiting for these men when they came home, a truth harder in some ways than the war itself. What happens to men who win everything and are handed nothing? What happens to a Medal of Honor? Recommendation that vanishes for 50 years. What happens to a quiet sergeant who kept a notebook of names because he did not trust his own army to remember them, and who turned out to be exactly painfully right? The war was over. The fight for the truth had not even begun. Some of those medals would eventually come, but they would arrive late, and for too many men, far too late. And in the final chapter of this story, the one almost no one knows, we find out what a country does with heroes it spent decades trying not to see. It started with one sheet of paper written in pencil on the lid of a footlocker by a tank sergeant who had been told his food belonged in the rain. That report reached General Patton, who drove 100 miles at midnight and ended a humiliation with 7 words. Then the men of the 761st spent 183 days proving it in fire, breaking the Bulge, cracking the Siegfried Line, driving a broken enemy across 3 countries. They had answered every question the army was too afraid to ask. But winning the war was supposed to settle it. It did not. So what happened to the men who won everything and were handed nothing? What happened to the quiet sergeant who kept a notebook of names because he did not trust his own country to remember them? This is the part of the story. Almost no one knows the part, with a final twist that took 50 years to arrive. Because sometimes the men who change history do it in a way the history books are built to lose, and sometimes the truth survives anyway, through the strangest and smallest of things. This is how it ended, and this is why it still matters. Calvin Reeves came home to the United States in 1945. He did not come home to a parade. There was no ceremony for the man who wrote the report, no medal pinned to his chest for the night a general drove through the rain because of him. He came home to a country that had asked him to cross an ocean and break the German army, and that still in a dozen states would not let him sit where he pleased on a bus or eat where he pleased in a diner. The war he had won abroad was not the war that waited for him at home. And Calvin Reeves, who had learned in Louisiana and Texas and eastern France exactly how his country saw him, was not surprised. But he did something with what he had. He used the GI Bill, the same law that built the post-war middle class, to study at a state college in a place with slightly more room for a black veteran than his home state allowed. He earned a teaching certificate. And then Calvin Reeves, tank commander, keeper of names, the man whose single sheet of paper had once pulled a general out of his headquarters at midnight, walked into a high school classroom and taught history. He taught it for 27 years. He stood in front of teenagers decade after decade and told them the truth about the country they lived in, the beautiful parts and the brutal parts, and he did not soften either one. Here is the moment that matters. His former students, tracked down by a journalist working on a local history project in the mid-1990s, remembered two things about him with perfect clarity. They remembered that he was precise, that he never romanticized the war, or the army, or the nation that had sent him to fight, while treating him as less than a full man. And they remembered that every single year, in every class, he told the story of the mess hall. But he did not tell it as a story about Patton. He told it as a story about the report. And he always ended it the exact same way, the same words year after year, until his students could recite them. He would say that he wrote the report because the report needed to exist, because if the record does not say it happened, then as far as history is concerned, it did not happen. And it happened. Think about what that means. This man had stood at the meeting point of the largest armies in human history. He had watched a 3-star general overrule the United States Army in a rainy yard at midnight. And when he told the story of his war to children, the hero was never the general. The hero was a piece of paper. The center of everything for Calvin Reeves was the simple, stubborn act of writing something down so that the truth would have somewhere to live. He died in 1989 at the age of 76, a retired schoolteacher in a quiet town, and almost no one at his funeral knew that the polite old history teacher in the casket had once changed an army with a pencil. But the real legacy of Calvin Reeves was never going to fit on a headstone, because he was right about the record. And the proof of how right he was is written all over the fate of the men he served with. Take Reuben Rivers, the tank commander who refused morphine and refused evacuation and stayed in his turret near Gebling until a German shell killed him. His commanding officer, a white captain named David Williams, recommended him for the Medal of Honor in 1945. It was the nation's highest award, earned as clearly as any man ever earned it. And the recommendation vanished. It did not get denied on the merits. It simply disappeared into the machinery, the way the dispatches disappeared, the way Reeves's report disappeared, and for a very specific reason that everyone understood and no one would write down. In all of the Second World War, in which more than 1 million black Americans served, not a single one received the Medal of Honor while the war was being fought. Not one. David Williams never let it go. For decades, that white officer fought the United States Army to honor the black sergeant who had died covering his men. He wrote letters. He gave testimony. He refused to stop. And finally, after an Army study commissioned in the 1990s confirmed what everyone had always known, that racism alone had kept these men from the medals they had earned, the record was corrected. On January 13, 1997, more than 50 years after Reuben Rivers died in the snow, the Medal of Honor was awarded in his name. It was accepted at the White House by his sister Grace, who was elderly by then, who had waited more than half a century for her country to admit what her brother had done. She said almost nothing that suggested she felt the wait had been worth it. 52 years is a long time to hold a grief the size of a nation's silence. And what of the others? Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the white commander who had refused every transfer and every promotion, rather than abandon. These men was shot down in the opening hours of their first battle, recovered and came back to lead them again. He stayed connected to his soldiers for the rest of his life, defending their record, insisting to anyone who would listen that they had been among the finest men he ever commanded. Trezvant Anderson, the black war correspondent who had watched the men eat in the rain and written it all down, did the one thing a journalist can do against forgetting. He wrote a book. In 1945, he published the unit's combat history so that the record of the 761st would exist on paper somewhere in the world, whether the Army liked it or not. He died in 1963. His papers, including a carbon copy of a dispatch the censors had killed, ended up in a university archive in the American South, in a box opened by only a handful of researchers in the decades since. And Patton, George S. Patton, the general who drove through the night, the man who requested these soldiers when other generals would not met his own complicated end. In the autumn of 1945, he was removed from command of the Third Army, in part over public statements minimizing the urgency of holding former Nazis accountable, and over the documented failures in how displaced persons, including Holocaust survivors, were treated under his occupation authority. The same man who arrived at midnight to say black soldiers would not eat in the rain in his area also presided over an occupation whose treatment of Jewish survivors drew criticism severe enough to help end his command. He died in a car accident in Germany on December 21, 1945, and never returned home. The midnight visit was real. The failures were real. The man was both, and any honest telling has to hold the whole of him, the courage and the cruelty, without pretending either one away. So the individual stories closed, some in honor, some in silence, most of them late. But the larger legacy of the 761st was still moving through history slowly, the way a stone's ripple keeps spreading long after the stone is gone. Here is the number that measures it. It took 33 years for the United States to officially recognize the battalion as a unit. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter finally awarded the 761st Tank Battalion the Presidential Unit Citation, the honor their record had earned in 1945 and been denied for a generation. 33 years. An entire generation of these men lived their whole post-war lives, raised their children, and in many cases died before their own country was willing to put its recognition in writing. A few of the old tankers were still alive in 1978 to stand and receive it gray-haired men in their 60s, holding at last a piece of paper that said what they had known since 1945. But the deepest legacy was not a citation. It was the argument these men had won without being allowed to make it out loud. Every officer who fought beside the 761st and saw what they could do became a living contradiction of the policy that segregated them. Their combat record became evidence cited in the studies and the arguments and the quiet institutional reckonings that followed the war. And in 1948, 3 years after VE Day, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, ordering the desegregation of the entire United States military. The order did not name the 761st. History rarely names the men who make the case. But the case had been made in the snow at Tilley and the villages of Lorraine by men who broke the enemy while their own army still doubted them. You cannot desegregate an argument you have already lost, and by 1948 the argument was lost. The proof was too heavy to carry any longer. That order changed everything downstream. By the time of the Korean War, just 2 years later, the American military was integrating in the field black and white soldiers fighting in the same units, something unthinkable in 1944. By Vietnam, an integrated military was simply the reality. The armed forces became, for all their remaining flaws, one of the first large American institutions to integrate fully, and it became a ladder that millions of Americans of every color climbed in the decades that followed. The men who were told to eat in the rain helped build the institution that would later be held up as a model of what integration could achieve. That is a legacy no medal could contain. But the largest lesson of this story was never really about tanks or armor, or even about one war. It was about something much older and much harder. It was about who gets to be believed. The men of the 761st were not held back because they lacked ability. They had the ability. They proved it on every gunnery range and every battlefield they were given. They were held back because a system had decided in advance what they were, and a system that has already decided the answer does not go looking for new evidence. That is the quiet machinery this whole story is really about. Not a villain twirling a mustache, but an institution full of ordinary men following ordinary rules, each one certain he was simply doing his job, and the accumulated weight of all that ordinary rule-following crushing men who had done nothing but everything asked of them. And it was about the strange, stubborn power of the record. Calvin Reeves understood something most people never grasp until it is too late. He understood that power decides what gets remembered, and that the first draft of history is written by whoever bothers to write anything at all. So he wrote. Anderson wrote. Williams wrote letters for 50 years. None of them could force the country to act in the moment. But they could make sure the evidence existed sitting in boxes and archives and old letters waiting. And when the country was finally ready decades later to look honestly at what it had done, the evidence was there. The record outlived the silence. It always does if someone is brave enough to keep it. You can see the same pattern everywhere if you look. The innovation dismissed because of who suggested it. The warning ignored because of who raised it. The truth buried because it was inconvenient only to surface years later when it could no longer be denied. History is full of Calvin Reeves's people with no rank and no power who changed things anyway simply by refusing to let a lie stand as the last word. Most of their names we will never know. That is exactly why the few we do recover matter so much. And the pattern did not end in 1945. Every institution alive today, every army, every company, every government still faces the same quiet test the United States Army faced in that rainy yard. Will it judge people by what they can actually do or by what it has already decided they are? The 761st answered that question in blood before the country was ready to hear the answer. And every time a modern organization finally promotes the person it overlooked for years or reopens a case it should never have closed or honors a contribution. It once ignored, it is repeating in miniature the lesson these men paid for in the snow. Talent was never the scarce resource. The willingness to see it was. And there is one final detail. The smallest and strangest part of the whole story. The thing that makes it land differently once you know it. Because here is the truth about that report. The one sheet of paper this entire story turns on. It does not exist. Calvin Reeves's original report, written in pencil on the lid of a footlocker on the night of the rain, is not in any archive on Earth. It is not in the records of the 761st. It is not in the brigade files. It is not in Patton's personal papers, which were carefully preserved and opened to researchers. The single document that pulled a general through the freezing dark simply did not survive. It was lost in the ordinary attrition of war, or destroyed in a post-war purge of records, or filed in a folder no one has ever thought to open. The Army, in the end, did not keep the thing it did not want to keep. So how do we know it happened? We know because of the fragments around the edges. We know because Patton's aide described the night decades later to a researcher writing the battalion's history. We know because that young duty officer wrote a letter to his wife the following week, and his family kept it. We know because Patton's documented pattern, confirmed again and again, was to personally confront officers who showed contempt for black soldiers under his command. And we know because in the early 1980s, a researcher preparing a documentary opened a dusty administrative file from a rear area facility in France and found a single flat line recording that dining arrangements had been modified to accommodate all personnel without separation. 7 words. The only official trace the Army kept of the entire night was 7 cold, bureaucratic words that erased the rain, the general, the midnight jeep, and the sergeant, and recorded only the result. And that, in the end, is the most honest monument this story has. Because the missing report proves Calvin Reeves right in a way no surviving document ever could. He wrote it precisely because he did not trust the Army to remember. The Army forgot the paper, but it could not forget the night, because too many other people refused to let it. The absence of the report is not the absence of the truth. It is the loudest possible evidence of exactly why he sat down and wrote it in the first place. So let us close where we began. A tank sergeant with a pencil told his food belonged in the rain, wrote 1 sheet of paper, and moved a general 100 miles through the dark. His battalion then fought 183 days, broke Hitler's last offensive, and helped make the case that desegregated the entire American military 3 years later, changing the lives of millions who came after. Reuben Rivers waited 52 years for his medal. The battalion waited 33 years for its citation, and the report that started it all was lost forever, which is the whole point. Calvin Reeves spent 27 years telling children that if the record does not say it happened, it did not happen. He was warning them. He was also, without ever saying so, describing the fight of his own life. The men who win history are not always the ones with stars on their helmets. Sometimes, They are the ones who simply refuse to let the truth go unwritten, who understand that memory is a battlefield too, and that the bravest thing an overlooked man can do is insist against all the weight of an institution that would rather forget that it happened. It happened, and now you know that it did.